In the previous session, we explored contingency funding plans, the practical playbook for how a bank responds when liquidity stress hits. But what determines the scenarios that banks prepare for in those plans? How do they know what to expect, what might go wrong, and how bad it could get? Now that's where liquidity stress testing comes into play. In this session, we're going to examine the role of stress testing in liquidity risk management. We'll look at how banks design stress scenarios, how they select assumptions, how they model outcomes, and how those outcomes feed into real-world decision-making. We'll also discuss regulatory expectations, model governance, and how stress testing fits into the wider risk management ecosystem. By the end of this session, you'll see how stress testing isn't just a regulatory exercise, it's a strategic tool for resilience, readiness, and resource planning. So let's start with the fundamental purpose of stress testing. The idea is simple: to evaluate how a bank's liquidity position would evolve under adverse but plausible conditions. Now, stress testing is about imagining the unexpected: loss of funding, rapid deposit withdrawals, market shutdowns, collateral calls, or ratings downgrades, and then quantifying their impact on the bank's liquidity profile. Now, when it's done well, stress testing helps a bank identify vulnerabilities, refine its risk appetite, guide contingency planning, and support the size and structure of its liquidity buffer. Now, stress testing also plays a key role in regulatory compliance. In the UK, the PRA expects banks to conduct robust internal liquidity stress testing as part of their ILAP. And in the EU, the European Banking Authority provides detailed guidelines for liquidity stress testing under the SREP framework. Now, these expectations go beyond the standardized assumptions used in the LCR and NSFR. They require banks to develop their own internal scenarios that reflect their unique business models, funding structures, and risk profiles. Now, a typical liquidity stress testing framework includes a series of components: the scenario design, the behavioral assumptions, the data inputs, the modeling engine, the outputs and reporting, and the governance structure around all of the above. Now let's walk through each of these in detail, starting with the scenario design. Now, banks typically develop a set of stress scenarios that fall into three broad categories: idiosyncratic stress, market-wide stress, and combined stress. And idiosyncratic stress involves a liquidity shock specific to the bank. For example, a sudden downgrade in its credit rating, negative media coverage, operational failure, or regulatory enforcement action. Now, these events could lead to higher funding costs, loss of counterparties, or deposit withdrawals specific to the bank rather than the market as a whole. Now, a market-wide stress assumes that broader financial markets are under pressure. Now, this could include a systemic banking crisis, a sovereign debt event, or a geopolitical shock. Now, in this scenario, all banks face similar stresses. Asset prices fall, funding costs rise, central bank actions become critical, and market liquidity dries up. So even strong banks may struggle to raise funding or monetize their assets. Now, a combined stress scenario brings the two together. Something specific to the bank occurs during a period of wider market disruption. Now, these are the most severe and are often used to calibrate the minimum liquidity buffer and contingency actions. Now, scenario design is both an art and a science. Scenarios must be severe enough to challenge the bank, but still plausible enough to be credible. They must be based on historical experience, market trends, and forward-looking judgment. For example, a scenario might include a 30% outflow of retail deposits over 10 days, a downgrade of 2 notches by rating agencies, and a 50% reduction in unsecured wholesale funding availability. Or it might assume increased haircuts on repo transactions, mass drawdowns of committed credit lines, or the failure of a key clearing counterparty. The goal is not to predict the future, but to explore the range of what could happen and how the bank would respond. The best stress testing programs use multiple scenarios across a variety of risk drivers, allowing management to compare results and assess the robustness of the liquidity position under different paths. Next comes the behavioral assumptions. Now, these are crucial as they drive how much funding is lost, how much liquidity is needed, and how fast the stress unfolds. Behavioural assumptions may include the percentage of corporate or retail deposits that are withdrawn under stress, the drawdown rate on undrawn committed facilities, the speed and extent of margin calls or collateral outflows, the usability of HQLA, including potential haircut increases or market liquidity, the refinancing rate of maturing wholesale debt, and the reaction of central banks or regulators to the stress. Now, these assumptions should be justified, documented, and regularly reviewed. They should be informed by historical data, peer benchmarking, supervisory feedback, and internal expert judgment. For example, during the COVID-19 crisis, many banks observed drawdowns of credit lines far beyond what their models had predicted. Now, that experience has since led to revisions in stress assumptions around contingent liquidity risk. Now, some firms also develop dynamic assumptions where behaviours evolve during the stress event. For instance, deposit outflows may accelerate if media coverage increases or if certain LCR thresholds are breached. Now, these dynamic features make models more realistic, but also more complex and more sensitive to model risk. Now, once the scenario and assumptions are defined, the next step is to run the model. Now, this is where banks use their liquidity forecasting engines to simulate daily cash flows, asset monetization, and funding availability under the stress scenario. Now, these tools typically generate things like liquidity gaps, so the difference between inflows and outflows over time, buffer usage, so how much of the HQLA is consumed and when, survival horizon, so the number of days the bank can continue to operate without new funding, and regulatory metric impact, so the projected path of LCR, NSFR, and other ratios under stress. Now, outputs must be granular, typically produced on a daily basis, and actionable, meaning they should feed into decision making. Now, the modelling must also cover multiple currencies, legal entities, and business lines, since liquidity is not always fungible across the organisation. Now, banks often define internal limits or triggers based on these stress test results. For example, they may require a minimum survival horizon of 30 days under a combined stress. Now, if a scenario shows a drop below that threshold, it may trigger management action, such as increasing the liquidity buffer, reducing asset growth, or tightening lending standards. Now, stress testing is also linked to risk appetite. The board may set risk appetite statements based on stressed outcomes. For example, the bank will maintain a minimum survival horizon of 45 days under a severe market-wide stress. Or no legal entity shall breach a 30-day stressed LCR under its idiosyncratic scenario. Now, these statements create clear boundaries for risk-taking and guide strategic decisions. Now, the outputs from stress testing are also used in the ILAP, where banks must demonstrate their liquidity adequacy under adverse conditions. Supervisors will review the assumptions, methodologies, results, and how those results link to management actions. If stress testing reveals vulnerabilities that are not addressed in practice, regulators may impose additional requirements. From a governance perspective, model oversight is critical. Most banks have a liquidity stress testing committee or similar forum that reviews scenarios, approves assumptions, and monitors results. Now, models should be validated within independent teams, often within model risk management, and subject to regular review. Validation includes testing model logic, data integrity, and sensitivity to key inputs. Stress testing is also supported by data infrastructure. Reliable stress testing requires timely, accurate, and reconciled data across funding sources, asset holdings, off-balance sheet items, collateral positions, and contractual terms. Now, many banks struggle with data fragmentation, particularly in large international groups. So investing in robust data aggregation and reporting capabilities is essential for credible stress testing. Now, an emerging trend in liquidity stress testing is the use of reverse stress testing. Now, this starts with a defined failure point, such as LCR dropping below 100% or survival horizon hitting zero, and works backwards to identify what sequence of events could cause that outcome. Now, this helps identify tail risks, correlations, and structural weaknesses that might not emerge in forward-looking scenarios. Another trend is the integration of climate risk and ESG factors into stress testing. For example, a bank may simulate a disorderly transition scenario in which carbon-intensive borrowers face funding constraints, regulatory sanctions, or reputational damage. Now, this can affect funding availability, client behavior, and collateral values, creating liquidity implications that traditional stress testing might miss. Now, some banks are also exploring real-time or near real-time stress testing using advanced analytics and AI tools. These allow stress testing to move from a quarterly or monthly exercise to a dynamic, scenario-driven tool that supports daily decision-making. For example, the impact of a sudden geopolitical shock or a market rumour can be modelled instantly, allowing faster and more informed responses. Importantly, stress testing is not just a back-office function. Its results must be discussed at senior levels, including ALCO and the board. Now, management must understand the scenarios, challenge the assumptions, and own the outcomes. Stress testing should not be a black box. It should be a living process that supports judgment, planning, and resilience. Now, to summarise, liquidity stress testing is one of the most powerful tools in a bank's liquidity risk arsenal. It allows firms to explore the impact of severe shocks, to test their readiness, and to make better decisions under uncertainty. It connects data with judgment, modelling with governance, and risk awareness with strategic planning. In a world of rising complexity and interconnected risks, stress testing helps banks stay one step ahead. In our next session, we'll turn our attention to the heart of daily liquidity operations, the Treasury function. We'll explore how Treasury teams manage liquidity buffers, execute funding strategies, interact with markets, and support both business and regulatory objectives. I'll see you in the next session.